No matter our age, one thing we all have in common is that we are all ageing. By 2040, a quarter of those of us living in the UK will be over the age of 60. Virtually 100% of us will be active online. And those of us over 55 will account for 63 pence of every pound spent, while those over 50 will make up for 40% of total earnings. Our homes, neighbourhoods and workplaces will all need to do a better job of adapting to the significant demographic and technological changes ahead. With an empathetic and people-centred approach, design is a powerful tool for translating people's needs into tangible products and services, enabling all of us to work, socialise, live independently and experience joy throughout our lives. The Design Age Institute was established in 2020 in response to the UK government's grand challenge on an ageing society. Combining skills and expertise from world-leading organisations in research, design, innovation and learning, we aim to transform support for ageing communities through the development of original research, products and services that will support people to remain at work for longer and help everyone to enjoy 5 extra healthy, independent years of life. Over the coming decades, the market for well-designed products and services for ageing consumers will only increase. Business and service providers now have a unique opportunity to tap into the enormous potential of the longevity economy by moving away from primarily focusing on illness and frailty and better responding to the needs, wants, interests, aspirations and demands of an ageing audience. Working collaboratively across industry, academia and the public sector, the Design Age Institute is perfectly placed to use design-led innovation to bridge the gap between people's needs as they age and the development of desirable and commercially viable products and services that increase demand and enable happier ageing. At the forefront of our strategy for delivering impact is research into the healthy ageing marketplace and National Directory for Design and Healthy Ageing, training and skills development for business leaders and creatives, Pathfinder initiatives to bring an array of exciting new products and services towards market, workshops, talks and exhibits to engage public audiences in the debate about the future of ageing, and an active community of healthy ageing advocates to promote and celebrate an age-inclusive society. These innovations will help make a real difference in the lives of every one of us as we age. Find out more by visiting designage.org.
Welcome. This is our second event here at the Design Museum as part of our Design Age Institute programme. My name is Colm Lowe. I'm Director of the Design Age Institute at the Royal College of Art. Very quickly, a couple of bits of housekeeping. Masks are not compulsory. But we would advise wearing them, certainly when you're moving around the museum or in crowded spaces still. There is no fire alarm due tonight, so if the fire alarm does go off, please do follow the visitor experience assistants and make your way outside following the fire exits to the block of flats in front of the museum. Toilets, for those who haven't used them yet, are out the doors and at the far right-hand side of the lobby on that floor, the floor we're on. And this No Time to Waste conference is part of the Waste Age exhibition at the Design Museum running until February 2022. We're also pleased to be live streaming this event as part of the Design Council's Design for Planet Festival, which is online today and tomorrow. For those who don't know and missed the video, the Design Age Institute was launched about a year ago. And we've been set up to become the strategic unit for design and the healthy ageing economy. We will be providing sort of strategic services around design and healthy ageing research, design interventions, design advocacy, and design training and education. Today's agenda is much like that, if we can keep it on time. We have a presentation from Sophia Dimitriadis coming up after I've stopped talking. We then have a brief presentation from George and Bobby coming in after that. And then there will be a panel discussion where a few of us will come up and talk about some of the issues about design, healthy ageing, and the environmental global warming situation, and what role design can play in any or all of it. And at last there will be a Q&A, a chance for you to save up your questions, and the audience online can ask as well. This is the code. You can find this on your Vimeo as well, but this is the code. If you want to QR it, then you can either do it through your telephone and just text your questions, or when we get to the Q&A, you can just put your hand up and we'll come and hear from you. There is a microphone going around. I'm not sure how necessary it will be due to the amount of people in the room. So, today's topic is largely uncharted territory, we think. But with COP26 taking place, there has never been a better time to consider the connections between the dual looming crises of a rapidly heating planet and a rapidly aging population. And what better moment to explore the role that design has in helping resolve these challenges. When I was a recently graduated designer, about 3 decades ago, my favourite quote was from George Bernard Shaw. And apologies for the obvious 19th century gender bias. But it read, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man." There was something about being a designer which meant I liked the idea of being unreasonable, of forcing positive change on a reluctant world. Designer as troublemaker, fire starter, hellraiser, and stew stirrer in general was something that appealed to me. This aligned to my idea also of human-centered design, a process that shaped the planet and its natural resources for the benefit of all. Well, all people, that is. And of course, that's where the problem lies. My new favourite quote is by Victor Papanek. There are professions more harmful than industrial design, but only a few. Designers are part of the whole production-consumption problem, whether we like it or not. Fast fashion and built-in obsolescence, out with the old, in with the new, keeping up with the Joneses, change, change, change. Change, what more change? Aren't things bad enough? As Queen Victoria rightly once complained. The days of the human-centred design might soon be consigned to the recycling bin. We must enter a new era, an era of planet-centred design, where the humans are only part of the solution and the planet is at the front. Also, when I started my career, I used to design for The Body Shop, and Anita Roddick, the founder, was a truly inspirational leader, and we tried to design her stores using environmentally responsible design principles. We followed the Good Wood Guide and a variety of other publications and principles that were about at the time. However, at the same time, I was also designing for a national supermarket, who I will not name in this presentation, but they did not follow the Good Wood Guide. They did not follow the Good Anything Guide, as far as I could make out. And the only way to get environmentally good practices into the stores was to get it in through the back door and not tell anybody. And this was fine as long as they didn't cost any more, but if there's an additional cost, then the client wanted to know why, and they were frequently just cancelled. The truth is that designers can only do what their clients let them do on the whole. It is, after all, a master-servant relationship, not a partnership. As much as we might like it to be, otherwise it is not. And here we still are, a planet approaching an environmental crisis, but this time with an aging population thrown into the mix to further confuse things. Now the choices are more difficult. How to embrace planet-centred design while designing inclusively for a rapidly aging population. These things do not always go hand in hand. To highlight one example, green transport plans seem to be focused on pedestrianisation, cycling, e-bikes, e-scooters, almost everything, few of which are inclusive of many older people, who might be broadly supportive of the concept, but many of whom may be experiencing age-related frailty, making these modes of transport unsafe or impractical. So how do we bring about change? How do we avoid decades of more neglect and hesitancy, more, and to quote Greta Thunberg, more blah, 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 and less action? From my time at the NHS, looking at patient safety, I learned that the most powerful change agent was a forcing function. This is making the wrong thing impossible to do, and the right thing either the only or the most logical option. not more blah, 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 but actual barriers to poor behaviour and poor choices. Ask the anti-smoking lobby. What had more impact? Half a century of adverts and public health warnings, or a ban on smoking indoors? What, if anything, can supporting an ageing population to live healthier, happy lives learn from the climate change movement, or any other movement or campaign for that matter? And what role can good design play in all of the above? That is, in theory, the subject of conversation tonight. So, to start the event properly, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Sophia Dimitriadis. Sophia is a senior economist at the International Longevity Centre. Sophia's work focuses on understanding the longevity economy and exploring ways to boost individuals' retirement prospects in the UK, as well as potential synergies between climate change and the ageing agenda. Welcome to the stage, Sophia.
Thank you, Colin, and it's really great to be here for inviting me. So as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the opportunity to link climate change and ageing population agendas. And I've done a little bit of a kind of evidence review of what's been said about connecting these agendas. So I'll firstly kind of briefly touch upon how these huge megatrends affect each other. And I'll secondly, in the kind of main body of the presentation, will consider how many ageing and climate agendas actually are largely disconnected and how they each could benefit significantly from being more connected. And I'll finally consider the opportunities that we have to support an ageing population to actually positively impact our environment and reduce any potential negative impact this could have. So we know we've got, our planet is warming, our population is ageing. I think everyone in this room knows about these two trends. But what is less discussed is how they will interact. And we know that, for instance, climate change actually negatively affects our health in many ways. So it'll increase the incidence of extreme heat waves and extreme weather events and heat waves, air pollution, which is linked to respiratory diseases, cardiovascular disease, but also cognitive decline. So it's also, some research shows it might be linked to dementia. We also see that climate change will increase the incidence of infectious diseases. It'll also negatively affect water quality and our quality of food supply, which of course will also affect our health. But what is less kind of discussed is actually that older adults are especially vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So this is both direct and indirect. So directly, we know they're more at risk from temperature extremes, so they're more at risk of becoming ill or dying as a result of these. And they're more likely to live in homes that are not energy efficient, so they're more likely to experience these temperature extremes in the first place. We also know that they're more susceptible to being affected by air pollution, extreme weather, and infectious diseases, as we've seen very starkly during the COVID pandemic. Indirectly, they're also largely quite vulnerable. So we know that climate emergencies actually disrupt healthcare services that older adults rely on. So that might be receiving care at home, the ability to receive medicines or go to hospital. That makes them especially vulnerable situations. And finally, we know that older adults may find it more difficult to actually flee a climate emergency. Whether this will be more important going forward. That might be because they're more likely to have physical health limitations, and we also know if they'd like to move country, if they need to move country as a result of a climate emergency, they might be more likely to face so just and finally, kind of indirect link is that older adults are less likely to be mobile in climate emergencies. They're more likely to have physical and health limitations, and more likely to face work and language restrictions if they need to move country. So they're vulnerable in that way as well. So I'll just show a video looking at the impact of heat waves on older adults from research in Australia.
Hello, my name is Tanya Segbedzi. I'm a Senior Research and Policy Officer at the Australian Association of Gerontology. Today I'm going to talk to you about our preliminary learnings from our rapid evidence assessment on heatwaves and older people in Australia. You may not know this, but heatwaves are the main threat to Australians' mortality from climate change. The aim of our paper was to analyse what we know about heatwaves and older people and to develop recommendations for policy and practice. We based our evidence assessment on a scoping review of literature published during an 18-year period about older adults and natural hazards. We then looked more closely at the 16 Australian publications that explored the topic of heat waves. Now I'm going to give you a brief overview of our preliminary learnings. Overall, the quality of the research evidence was low, but the papers provided valuable insights. During the period 1844 to 2010, there were 350 heat waves recorded in Australia, and they were responsible for an estimated 5,332 deaths. The future impact is estimated at 120 to 130 excess heat deaths per year by the year 2030. But once climate change projections are factored in, deaths of 5 times greater than that number are predicted. During 1988 to 2011, heat waves resulted in an average death increase of 28% for people aged 75 plus, and they appear to have a greater impact on women. There's also a significant increase in hospitalisation for older people with some health conditions. For example, the rates are 10 times higher for people with heart disease and 20 times higher for people with dementia. In 2010, many organisations that support older people did not have heatwave management plans, although things may have changed since then. The papers also identified a need for education of health professionals, staff of organisations that support older people and their families, both before and during heat waves. Long-term risk reduction must also consider urban planning, building design, community development and social equity. Conversion of existing houses for heatwave conditions is a significant challenge in Australia. A pilot study of a typical house in South Australia found that none of the retrofit measures tested had a significant impact, and these included insulation, external blinds and double glazing. It was impossible to achieve thermal comfort during a heatwave without air conditioning. However, some older people cannot afford the cost of installing or replacing air conditioners or servicing them. Also, older people are often reluctant to use an air conditioner due to the increasing cost of electricity. The South Australian pilot study found that air conditioning just one bedroom and restricting occupation to that room during the heatwave is an affordable solution. Other practice responses suggested in the papers include additional contact with vulnerable people during heat waves, establishing air-conditioned cooling centres in hospitals and aged care facilities, and health messaging about increasing fluid intake. Some additional risk factors were identified in the papers, and these included homelessness, dementia, some specific medical conditions, being culturally and linguistically diverse, living in an urban environment, or living on a low income. Only one publication looked at aged care specifically, and it found that living in residential care actually reduced risk during a heatwave. Based on our learnings, we've come up with 12 preliminary policy and practice recommendations, and they include suggestions around planning, education, register of vulnerable people, additional contact with older people, establishing cooling centres, homelessness outreach, facilitating access to air conditioning, prevention strategies for high-risk medical conditions, health messaging around hydration, backup strategies during power outages, improving urban planning and building design, and conducting further research. Our paper is currently undergoing academic review and we hope to publish it shortly. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you today.
So some really interesting implications for designers and how we can better protect older adults from heat waves. We know they're disproportionately affected. So we've seen that, climate change disproportionately impacts on older adults and an ageing population, but how will an ageing population affect our ability to deal with climate change? Well, primarily because, it will have far-reaching implications because aging is a major driver of population growth going forward. So we know in most countries in the world,
fertility is falling, but life expectancy is increasing. So it will be through this mechanism that we'll see an increase in human demands and natural resources going forward if the status quo prevails. So it doesn't make sense to ignore this trend. So we see there's clear links between these two agendas, but at least up till recently, our responses have been largely disconnected. But more recently, so around 2020 and 2021, we've actually seen a number of reports identifying the potential benefits that could arise from greater linkages between these two agendas. So what are these benefits? Well, firstly, the first kind of few points arise from the fact that ageing and climate change interact with each other, as we just mentioned. So firstly, just from a pragmatic perspective, sustainability measures are simply more effective if a growing part of our population is engaged with these measures and are able to adopt them. Secondly, given the fact that climate change disproportionately impacts on older adults, sustainability measures directly benefit ageing agendas. They should be a key strategic part of these agendas. And finally, because older adults are especially vulnerable to the effects of climate change, adaptation policies may be more effective if they consider older adults' specific needs, so they're tailored to their needs, and by linking those agendas, they're better able to get the knowledge they need to make more effective policies and design policies. The second key argument is that it's more efficient to actually simultaneously undertake inclusive and sustainable investments at once. It's just much more time, takes a lot more time, and takes a lot more funding to do these separately, one after another. But we need to do both going forward. And finally, there's a lot of arguments that actually we can increase the investment in synergistic interventions, so interventions that benefit both agendas. So for instance, encouraging more people to engage in active travel supports healthy aging, it prevents illness, but also reduces climate emissions. But by linking these agendas, we're more likely to allocate more funding into these agendas, and by demonstrating that one agenda actually is collaborating with the other, again, we can obtain more funding, particularly for ageing agendas which have gained less traction from global policymakers relative to climate change. So which agenda should we link? Well, I'll start with a couple that have been kind of discussed in this recent literature. So firstly, healthy aging and sustainable food agendas. So when I say healthy aging, I'm talking about preventing illness to ensure that people can live healthily in later life. So essentially, the idea is that food systems have the potential to improve human health and support environmental sustainability, but they're currently not doing that. They're threatening both. And so we do have this opportunity to efficiently enhance planetary and human health by reforming the food system in one go. We know we need to do it, so why do it separately? And this could meaningfully support healthy aging because of that link between climate change and health. It just doesn't make sense to ignore that from a healthy aging perspective. Secondly, there are a number of arguments that it's important to link healthy aging and age-friendly city agendas and sustainable city agendas. So, for instance, it may be important to ensure that sustainable transport options and sustainable housing infrastructure that we know is being developed every day is inclusive to older adults, so we ensure that it's accessible for people with mobility constraints, but also understandable to use, and that's something that's often more forgotten, to ensure that people with cognitive decline are able to use these transport or infrastructure, and again, incorporate the lived experience into this design. And the key arguments for doing so include efficiency. Again, it's more efficient to do both. We need to do these investments. Some of these are synergistic. They benefit both agendas. Public transport supports older adults, many of those who might not be able to drive, particularly if they're experiencing dementia, but also, of course, sustainability agendas. And finally, it's more effective. We need to get older adults on board. They're going to be the growing demographic going forward. And the European Innovation Partnership on Healthy Aging, a group set up by the European Commission, have argued that there need to be better links with the European Innovation Partnership on Sustainable Cities. And actually, there's too few links so far, and these agendas are kind of going off in isolation. There's also arguments that this could, linking these two agendas could produce further resources for the age-friendly and sustainable cities movement, but particularly the age-friendly movement, which has actually faced a lot of cuts going forward in recent years, and to ensure that measures are sustainable going forward. We also have opportunities to ensure that age-friendly communities consider the impact of climate change. So we know, older adults are disproportionately affected. And this is especially the case in coastal towns. There's a lot of research arguing that actually age-friendly community agendas are not considering the impact of climate change, including in areas, for instance, there's some research in Canada saying, in coastal towns where people are particularly at risk, there's a large proportion of older adults residing there, very few services nearby, emergency services, health services, and we need to be doing, really linking those agendas. That should be probably one of the top priorities going forward, given the risks that they're facing. There's also some evidence that some arguments that in countries where the population is declining, so for instance in Japan, but we know that's the case in many countries going forward, there'll actually be an interesting opportunity for designers in particular to transform low-density land into inclusive green spaces. So there's the idea of a kind of compact city approach there, where we can, be ensuring that our housing and transport is more compact, and then we can free up some land and develop green spaces. And this could have extremely positive benefits. We know that green spaces are linked to better physical and mental health outcomes, but also if they're designed in the right way, they can protect people and infrastructure from the effects of climate change, so they can support adaptation, support our ability to adapt to climate change. So really interesting implications for designers there. Another kind of two agendas that we should be linking, arguably, are the healthy ageing and inclusive housing agendas, which I've touched upon, and sustainable housing and energy agendas. The research is showing that housing quality in relation to energy efficiency actually disproportionately impacts on the health and also economic well-being of older adults. So I've touched upon the fact that older adults are more susceptible to heat and cold-related morbidity and mortality, but they're also more likely to use more energy. They're generally at home for longer, so that is linked to fuel poverty in later life. So key recommendations include better linking energy and health policies more closely. It's really important if we're, to ensure that we're thinking about an older adults residing somewhere, thinking about their health plans and thinking about their energy efficiency in the building, making those connections, because currently that's often not the case. We should also be thinking about, when we're thinking about housing, specialist housing for older adults, ensuring that it incorporates the technology that makes housing both age-friendly and sustainable on efficiency grounds. Again, we should be doing this together. And a lot of reports argue there's a lot of technology already out there that can make water-saving systems, energy-saving systems inclusive, and it's not to the detriment of the occupant. So why are we not using that more? There's also an opportunity to link climate adaptation strategies and age-inclusive agendas more generally. So essentially, climate adaptation strategies need to be inclusive of older adults to be effective. That's what we're seeing from the research. And actually including older adults and organisations that represent them in decision-making can ensure that these are effective. So a really recent report by the UN actually had some quite stark implications that actually ageism and ableism have meant that climate mitigation programmes actually sometimes exclude older adults, so the support they're given might be inadequate or kind of less than younger adults because of discrimination. So in essence, age discrimination has actually been found to magnify the impact of climate change on older adults, who we know are the most vulnerable. And they attribute this to an absence of binding international instruments and key climate instruments for enabling this to happen. So we need to be protecting the human rights of older adults in these climate instruments. And finally, they kind of argue quite forcefully that older adults possess enormous knowledge, experience, and skills and resilience to help us to adapt to climate change. So they're well aware of how vulnerable communities are. They know, often they are the most vulnerable in these situations. So they've got that knowledge and they're quite aware of capabilities. Like internationally, there's a lot of research to show this. So we should be using that to make sure we have the most effective solutions. And of course, there's also a human rights imperative to do so. So the next, the kind of final two agendas I think we should be linking are the organisational strategies of health systems and social care systems with sustainability agendas. And a key reason for this is that health systems are actually huge emitters. And actually, before I've started doing research on this, I was pretty shocked, actually, that the NHS emits more CO2 every year than all aircraft departing from Heathrow. And actually, globally, healthcare's climate footprint is around 4.4% of global net emissions. This is really considerable. We're not hearing this that much in the media. And what's driving this? Well, actually, it's mainly the healthcare supply chain, and actually the pharmaceutical industry is actually incredibly emission intensive, so there's lots of progress that we could be making in those areas. But looking at the literature, it seems that there's a little bit less evidence on the specific climate footprint of social care. So there's it is mentioned in different reports, but it's more difficult to find specific numbers there. So I think there's a key evidence gap there. And linking this all back to ageing, we know that the demand for health and social care is expected to rise in future, mainly due to an ageing population. So we've all seen the figures, and that is quite worrying if these are quite emission-intensive sectors. So kind of based on all those points, and also going back to the previous point that climate change negatively impacts on health, many reports are calling for sustainability to be a key strategic objective of health systems. Some of these reports aren't actually very linked to ageing, but I think they're very relevant given that increase in demand going forward. But there's also another key argument for linking these two agendas. So interestingly, actually, taking a sustainability approach may also directly support other health system objectives. So there's really key synergies from doing what we need to make our health systems more efficient going forward, and also more sustainable. So in 2012, the King's Fund discussed in a report discussed a number of co-benefits between sustainability and public health initiatives. And they include financial co-benefits. So for instance, if we reduce the financial cost of health systems by reducing medicines mismanagement, so waste in terms of what we're prescribing, moving towards telehealth, so ensuring that people are less likely to miss appointments, that's of course incurs sustainability benefits, but also financial savings. There are also a number of health co-benefits, so we know that active travel and preventing ill health actually benefits health, but also sustainability directly. And finally, there are a number of quality co-benefits. So for instance, health system, a key health system objective is to reduce duplication among health services and to make a more streamlined service. That, of course, is, for quality purposes, it's very stressful for the patient, very costly, but that's also going to be more sustainable. And so kind of overall, really, the key message here is actually improving efficiency at the operational level is insufficient. We need to be actually fundamentally transforming the service model of health systems to become more sustainable, because it's such a huge challenge. And we actually, without doing so, we'd be missing all these synergies. So it's really key that we do that going forward. And moving on to social care systems, essentially there's less specific research on social care systems. So it's kind of mentioned in other reports, but not kind of solely. So we're not really sure about what the climate impact is, what the progress is in terms of cutting emissions, and kind of what the synergies are. So I think there's an evidence gap there for future. And this was mentioned, in the King's Fund report, a 2013 Scottish Health Network report also mentioned there's a huge opportunity to make social care systems more sustainable as a result of our ageing population, but we lack some data and evaluation mechanisms to really understand progress in that sector. And a final thing to note is that there are a lot of interventions, as mentioned, that actually benefit both agendas, and that's been mentioned in a lot of reports. So how can we increase investment in these? And one interesting idea in a recent study published in The Lancet actually argues that we need to kind of change the way we evaluate different interventions. So we need to consider a social return of investment and widen our concept of value so that it incorporates environmental degradation and health and well-being. So next time we're considering which preventative intervention we should be prioritising, if we're taking into those two things into account, hopefully prioritising some of the interventions that incorporate both agendas. And I don't think that's always the case at the moment. So I've kind of mentioned that, there's a lot, we need to be making more progress, but actually there is change that's happening. I think there's a lot that we can build upon from these really interesting initiatives. So just really kind of top level, we're seeing at the UN, the Sustainable Development Goal on Sustainable Cities and Communities actually discusses the need for cities to be inclusive to older adults and more environmentally sustainable. So it does this in one place, where we're not seeing so many connections in some of the World Health Organization reports. So I think it's really positive. We're also seeing, in terms of thinking about healthy and sustainably sourced food agendas, there's actually been a lot of recent research that led to the introduction of the planetary health diet, which is basically an optimal diet. It's healthy and it's good for the planet. I think I should adopt this. But essentially, that there's some targets there for countries to really move forward with this. So it's a really important piece of research. We're also seeing a number of action by retailers. So Sainsbury's and Tesco's are undergoing certain kind of challenges recently to make it easier for consumers to buy more healthy and sustainable food in one go. And finally, really interesting, in 2020, the UK government actually launched a competition for house builders to design age-friendly, energy-efficient homes. So again, really linking those in one go. Turning to kind of health systems, social care systems, we're seeing some really positive advancements from the NHS. They've got a net zero commitment, and we're seeing that sustainability is actually a key strategic objective. But there are implementation barriers across NHS trusts, so there's a difficulty of actually translating these strategies into practical action, which I'm sure we all know that's always a struggle. But some key issues include difficulties actually getting the funding, upfront costs. There's a lack of training and guidance, and also data to understand what is the actual climate impact of the supply chain. That's always quite tricky. And essentially, there's a need for a more enabling policy framework for local health policy leaders. So key kind of ideas to address this could be better incentives to incentivize health leaders to adopt innovative approaches relative to the status quo, so they can get the funding they need and they're incentivized to try this. Perhaps regulatory measures, and also, as we mentioned, changing the way we evaluate cost-benefit kind of techniques to incorporate sustainability so they can get the funding they need. And just kind of thinking about the NHS globally, actually, the approach that's taken is actually unique. Most international health systems, are becoming more energy efficient, they're recycling, they're doing the obvious kind of changes, but they're treating environmental sustainability as a technical rather than organizational challenge, and as such, they're missing out on those synergies that we talked about. So there's a lot more to kind of go in terms of global health systems. And the final part, just a few slides now, part of the presentation will consider the opportunities to support an ageing population to positively impact our climate. So I've got 3 key areas. The first key area is, thinking about the huge potential we have to increase older adults' engagement in environmental volunteering. So that could be, volunteering with your local woodland trust, checking kind of the samples of ponds to understand what's going on there, but also climate campaigning as the population ages. And why is that? We know that, there's a considerable change in our population demographics, but actually, on average, we're living more years and lived in good health. So not every year, additional year of life expectancy is lived in good health, but many are. So we have more time and more years lived in good health, so we have the opportunity to engage as we age. We also know that, so ILC's research actually found that people aged 65 and over across Europe, for instance, actually volunteer more hours on average, but that actually participation rates fall at older ages. So we're seeing that those that volunteer are volunteering more hours, but actually there are fewer volunteers in later life. And that's likely due to the barriers. There's a lot of papers talking about how, volunteering opportunities might not be inclusive to specific health needs. They might not be in areas where older adults reside. They might be worried about taking transport, going far away. And generally, there's a kind of some exclusion there. So there are avoidable barriers that we could overcome. And finally, it's important to note that we already know that volunteering is linked to better health and well-being outcomes as we age, but actually environmental volunteering is found to have added health and well-being benefits. So huge synergies between the environmental volunteering agenda and healthy aging agendas. So kind of going specifically then to the barriers that to environmental volunteering in later life, a number of papers have found a couple of key points, and they are firstly that older adults feel that they lack sufficient expertise about environmental issues. They're not actually aware of what opportunities are out there. They'd actually be really keen to utilise their professional expertise that they've gained through their working life, so more interested in many cases leadership roles that aren't always available, and often perceive environmental volunteering to be less socially fulfilling than other volunteering options. And interestingly, the data in the US actually shows that older adults are less likely to participate in environmental volunteering opportunities compared to other volunteering opportunities. So, these barriers are may be quite important. But interestingly, there's a model called the RISE model, which has been tried out in the US on a small scale, and that aims to essentially address these barriers via a structured approach. And a 2017 evaluation study found that it was largely effective in recruiting older adults to these opportunities and was actually increased health and well-being outcomes among particularly novice volunteers. So really positive findings, and potentially there is an opportunity to scale this up, modify it for countries internationally, and try to address these barriers further. Another key opportunity we have, and I think really important and relevant to designers, is to ensure that older consumers consume sustainably going forward. And this is really key because all the research is showing that older consumers are the fastest growing consumer base, across the world. Our research showed in the G20 and also in the UK. And this is not just because of more older adults going forward. Actually, each older adult is spending more on average because their spending power is growing, their market power is growing. So there's a really significant opportunity there. But I just want to talk about the longevity dividend agenda, just to put this in context. So what we know is that in later life, people actually tend to spend less and save more. So we're seeing these trends over time, but there's still this drop in spending as we age. And there's a lot of research that thinks that avoidable barriers may partly attribute that drop in spending. So it might be because of poor health, a lack of inclusive goods and services to support people's specific health needs. So think about a mobile phone that's not suited to someone with poor eyesight, and also a lack of inclusive town centres and transport to actually go to the shops. So they're all very linked. And essentially, the longevity dividend agenda is saying that we need to address these barriers to spending. This will benefit the economy, ensure that we can support consumption going forward, to support the jobs of older and younger adults alike going forward. But also, more importantly, important for well-being, as health and well-being, as Colin mentioned earlier. It's not a good idea to exclude people from the economy going forward. And if these goods and services are adapted to the needs of us all as we age, we can ensure that we can live independently, participate socially, and it is really important. There's a lot of research linking the two. So it is key in terms of an aging agenda. But of course, if we're not thinking about sustainability, this could be, have really significant negative impacts. So we need a green longevity dividend. We need to link these agendas together. So how green are older consumers? Well, the research is showing that it's a little bit mixed, these findings. So what we see is that age is actually negatively related to intended green behaviour, but positively associated with actual green behaviour. So what I mean is that we're seeing that older adults are less likely to say they intend to adopt green behaviours, to recycle, to buy sustainably. But actually, if you look at the data in many countries, they're actually often doing that more on average. So some of the explanations for this actually might be that younger adults might possess, or younger members of the population, might possess fewer financial resources, so it might be more difficult for them to translate those intentions into action. But that said, there are still opportunities to support sustainable consumption further among older adults. So a UK study found that older adults are moderately green and actually concluded that there is scope for improvement. There is also a number of studies that show there might be some easy-to-address barriers that older adults face to consuming sustainably, and a lot of them relate to labelling. So it could be that older adults say that unclear labelling is an issue. They're not often clear about the environmental impact of a purchase, and so reluctant to actually to buy it. And many actually say they find it difficult to find sustainable products. They're not sure what's available. So we need to make it as easy as possible. So yeah, a challenge there for designers and market professionals. We also know that new innovations are actually being adopted and created on a daily basis. So we can have the opportunity to influence these early on. A lot of these are they're new at the early stage. And we see governments' initiatives are really supporting innovations for ageing. So for instance, in the EU, you have the Silver Economy Forum that's offering support to innovators across the EU to address the specific needs of older adults going forward and to tap into that growing consumer base. In the UK, we have the UKRI Healthy Aging Innovation competition, and again, that's encouraging innovators to make products and services that support healthy aging. But interestingly, these agendas rarely discuss sustainability. On the key criteria of the competitions, we're not thinking about sustainability. And I think these are new innovations that are happening every day. We need to be addressing this at the design stage. And the final opportunity we have is to make is to encourage more pension company clients to invest sustainably as a population ages. I think this is a really interesting opportunity. We know that assets in pension funds are growing considerably, and partly as a result of our aging population. We're working for longer. State pension age is increasing soon, so we're investing in a pension for longer. And these assets contain trillions of dollars worldwide, and the OECD and many other actors have argued that they have a key role to play in financing green growth initiatives. So I'm not sure if you heard Prince Charles at COP mentioning that we can't just rely on government funding. We need the private sector to get involved. There is some great progress, but I think there's more that can be done here. And something that's less known is that actually going green on your pension can often have a greater impact than other behavioural changes. So for instance, going vegan or driving less. And that's because you might be moving a portfolio that's investing in companies related to fossil fuels into a company that's actually doing positive green investment. So it can be really significant for some people. And again, if you're looking at some of the media coverage over COP, I haven't seen anything talking about the ability for individuals to kind of invest their pension more sustainably. We're hearing about going vegan and other ideas, but not this. So I think there's a lot more that can be done here. But again, there's barriers to people investing sustainably. So the research is showing actually the majority of pension company clients are really interested in sustainable investment and investing in their pension sustainably. But actually few people do. And why is that? Because they lack knowledge, they're not sure about what they can impact, what their pension is being invested in, and the know-how. So again, we can think of design solutions to address these barriers. So just to conclude, what we've been talking about is that these two megatrends, climate change and aging population, will significantly interact with each other going forward. But despite this, our responses have largely been disconnected. But connecting them can actually increase efficiency, ensure that we're investing more in both of these agendas and secure more funding. And we also know because of these links, it just doesn't make sense to not incorporate these agendas together. We also know there could be significant benefits considering some specific agendas. So for instance, age-friendly and sustainable city and housing agendas, community and climate adaptation strategies, and integrating sustainability into key health and social care system objectives. And finally, we have the opportunity to support ageing populations to positively impact the environment by incentivizing them to consume sustainably, addressing any barriers to this, and encouraging consumers to opt for green pension investments. So thank you for listening and look forward to the Q&A.
My microphone is working or not. I'm going to assume it is and just continue talking until somebody comes down and tells me otherwise. But thank you, Sophia, that's great. And as you mentioned, please save up your questions towards the end. Or post them on the Vimeo link and we'll try to get round to them all when we can. I'd like to now move on to the next presentation by George Lee and Bobby Duffy, who will explore whether younger people really do care more about climate change than older people. George, in her role as community lead at the Design Age Institute, launched This Age Thing in 2021 to build a diverse community of age activists, storytellers, creatives, designers, and change makers. A respected disruptor and innovator and leader, George is also founder of the specialist consultancy The Common Land, which champions cross-generational thinking as a key for social and economic impact. Bobby Duffy is Professor of the Public Policy and Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London and author of the recently published book, Generations, Does When You're Born Shape Who You Are? We'll be plugging that a bit later, but if you haven't bought it, take a note and do go out and buy it. This book challenges the myths and stereotypes around generational trends, seeking a greater understanding around generational challenges. Welcome to the stage, Bobby and George.
The community lead for This Age Thing, and one of our biggest focuses, I suppose, is to break down the myths and the stereotypes around ageing. And I think one of the biggest stereotypes that we have is that older people are not really interested in climate crisis. So this is what we're going to be talking about in the next 10, 15 or so minutes. And I have it at home. I've got a 19-year-old daughter who is constantly telling me that my generation and the people who are older than me are the ones that actually destroy this planet. So this was sorry. Okay, I'll leave that as well. Okay, so I'll do that in a second.
So I was absolutely delighted when I came across Bobby Dovey, because actually he gave me the ammunition to be able to confront my daughter and say this is not the case.
Generational connection.
Well, exactly. But, it's sort of like, a little bit of warfare as well, which actually is what I want to start off with. So there is a quote by Billie Eilish, who I think is rather fantastic, and so does my daughter, and so do a lot of people. And she says, and I got this quote from Bobby's book, and she says, hopefully the adults and the old people start listening to us about climate change. Old people are going to die and don't really care if we die, but we don't want to die yet. So, Bobby, okay,
Yeah.
so that is quite a juicy quote about sort of like generational tension and connection. So I want to start with you. So where does this feeling of generational tension and warfare come from?
Yeah, well, I mean, Billy is far from alone in kind of propagating that type of rhetoric around this. So when Time magazine made Greta Thunberg their Person of the Year in 2019, they called her an avatar in a generational battle between old and young. So the tone is kind of set. And did people see Barack Obama yesterday, where it was all about young people staying angry? That was the repeated theme of it. And all of that comes from good intention, I am sure, and lots of the campaigning comes from good intention. But it just creates this background of unthinking ageism that the work that I'm doing, and I don't want to preempt your little taster of it, shows it's just not based on reality. That this idea that older people don't care about climate change, and obviously that they don't care about future generations, is just not true.
No, absolutely. And I think that there's a line that you use in your book, which I think is so powerful, that these generational stereotypes are lazy at best, but are actually incredibly dangerous and very, very divisive.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did a little piece today, wrote a little piece today on how Gen Z are killing the Brussels sprout, which it was like a Mail Online article last week. And you've got hundreds, thousands of those articles, these little bits that seem quite fluffy in terms of generational stereotypes, but then they add up to bigger generational stereotypes. And then I think actually the most dangerous and destructive one is this fake difference on climate change between old and young. Because just going back to your first question, I think there was some truth in it, where what you always find when you've got a culture change or societal change is that younger people tend to be more at the leading edge of those changes. They notice first, they're less fixed. But that's quite an old view of population attitudes towards climate. Those gaps have been closed over the years. Everyone's concern is increased, everyone's commitment to climate change is increased. Dealing with climate change has increased, and those gaps have narrowed over time. So there was a little kernel of truth in the younger generations being more at the leading edge of this, but it's no longer the case, and we're really slow at updating our views on these types of things. So, so all of those types of things make it not true and incredibly destructive, because if there's anything that we need to rather unite people on rather than divide them, it's this type of issue.
Absolutely, and I think there is something that you write in your article. So Bobby's written a really very powerful story in this week's This Age thing. So I do recommend you read that, and I will be plugging Bobby's book in a second, because it really is quite extraordinary. But you're talking about it becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, and actually what we're going to do now is look at three of the questions that Bobby asked in his research, which when I read the answers, I was absolutely delighted by, in a way, but also incredibly surprised, because I had been indoctrinated by the media, which basically says older people are just not interested in the climate crisis. So the first question that you asked was, thinking about the UK population overall, on average, which age groups do you think is most likely to say that there is no point changing their behaviour to tackle climate change because it won't make any difference? Okay, so, I mean, it is... Right, are you ready for the unveiling? Okay, I'm going to do it now. There you go. So, Bobby, do you want to explain what's going on in this slide? I mean,
we've sort of broken the suspense by setting it up as you're going to be.
But it is suspenseful.
No, so, I mean, we think, more of us think that it's baby boomers and older people who've kind of given up, who don't think there's much type of change, and fewer of us think it's Gen X, Millennials and Gen Z, but the actual percentages are 29% for Gen X, Millennials and Gen Z combined, and 21% for baby boomers. So what this shows is that it's actually younger people who are more likely to say there's no point in changing our behaviour, but it's our perception of other people is that it's older people who think that. So we've got it the wrong way round, and we've kind of bought into that idea. I mean, I think there's some complexity in here because, you know, the view of whether individuals can change behaviour, can change their behaviour, can actually change the outcome on climate change. Maybe there's a bit more sophisticated understanding among younger people about we need more systemic change, those types of things. Maybe an element of that within there, but we see it across lots of different questions that actually our stereotype is that older people don't care or have given up. That is our perception, but the reality is more like this, more this way around.
Exactly, and I think this is powerful. So this is just one of many. So the second one is, which age groups do you think was most likely to have boycotted products or companies for socially conscious reasons in the last year? So that was the question. So I wish we were doing a poll now to see what you all thought. That would be rather exciting, wouldn't it? But anyway, I'm going to do the drum roll. Are you ready for it? Okay, here we go. Bobby, do you want to share?
Yeah, again, it's comparing this reality with our perception. So we utterly think, well, huge weight towards thinking it's millennials or Gen Z who are most likely to have boycotted products. But then if you look at the column of figures, that's the actual percentage who have boycotted products for social purpose reasons. And it is baby boomers, then Gen X, pretty close together on this, with younger generations actually lower on this. And this is across countries and across time. This is much more of a life cycle effect than it is a cohort effect. So you kind of grow into boycotting behaviour. Maybe you just get grumpier as you get older. Maybe you get more resources so that you can
or more wise.
Choose. More wise, yes, yeah. All sorts of reasons. I mean, there's kind of all sorts of motivations. But there's a repeated pattern across countries. Of course, but our perception is the other way round again, which is... and just to sort of embellish on that point about norms is... The problem with all of these things is we know we're quite driven by our perception of the norm. And if we perceive the norm for our group is to not act or not care, then we're less likely to act or care ourselves. So it's actually important that we don't create these self-fulfilling loops.
Absolutely. And the final question that we're going to look at today, which age groups do you think are most likely to make a change to their own lifestyle to reduce the impact of climate change? Another drum roll.
I think people have seen the pattern now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, do you think so?
Yeah. So it's actually, there's no difference, and you see that in lots and lots of different measures. No difference. This is in terms of commitment to saying you would like to. And this, we did the same sort of thing in the US, same sort of pattern throughout. And if you got the next one on what they or not, do we
know?
We've
only got
okay,
those
so
two,
when we get people to guess that, they've got the same misconception. They think it's older people are saying they're not willing to do that. They're not. So it's the same sort of pattern as young people perceived to be more willing to change than older people, but it not really held up at all in any of the survey figures. There is one, so again, qualification on this, which is the one thing that we do see difference is older groups less willing to trade off economic growth against climate. When in these types of questions, you say, can you sacrifice economic growth? And that's a really interesting one, I think, because it stands out compared to lots of these other things, and it's probably slightly related to the kind of cohort effect of growing up in a different sort of system. You're used to that as the kind of model, and you do actually get more set in those types of ways. So one of the key debates with older people in particular, if we're thinking about, instead of having exclusionary climate messages, which we get quite a lot of now by age. If we're thinking more inclusive ones, we have to deal with that economic argument with older people. You need to deal with that very sensitively, that it's not necessarily a zero-sum game between climate and the economy, and we just need to think that through how we present that.
Thank you. So I've got a question for you. So in terms of the research, have you presented it to people of different ages, and how have they responded to it?
Yeah, I mean, I did a COP panel this morning, but virtually, and it was very similar sort of themes to this, and people are still surprised by it. I mean, I think that is the case. It's quite embedded, and it's quite and both age groups haven't really had a difference in it, because I think we've all heard the same sorts of messages, and we heard them at COP even this week. So no, I think it's not. There is surprise mostly, and it is across the age groups rather than one, but not the other.
Yeah, and I've got just something which I'm really fascinated. Why is it that media companies, journalists, TV programs, all of those, why do they still focus on that generational warfare rather than, as you said in the end of the article in this age thing, this is such an important issue. Rather than fighting generations, we should be working together. Yeah. Why are journalists still focusing on the warfare?
Oh, journalists love conflict, and then we love conflict between age groups. I mean, it's like, again, on this Brussels sprouts piece, you can trace that back to Socrates, and he hated young people in his day and thought they were the worst generation ever. And we always think the next generation, the most recent generation of young people, is the uniquely weird and wrong about things. And that's completely natural in some ways. That is how society changes. In the very big thinkers in generational terms about Karl Mannheim and Auguste Comte, who, a sociologist and a philosopher who thought a lot about generational change. That's a healthy thing for societies to have tension between generations, because otherwise, because we get stuck in our ways, and as they talk about it, if you didn't have that, society turns into a stagnant pond. So there's some element of generational tension is a really good thing. But what we have done a lot of, because of the changing nature of our media and social media, exaggerates the extremes and encourages emotional responses. It's kind of built into the system. You've got this more fractious debate. So we've had this period effect of a changing media and social media that gives us this impression of a greater gap between young and old than actually exists. But it's very systemic, and I do think, I don't want to keep going on about Barack Obama, but I do think those types of things really feed into it, from politics to media and back again. That sort of sense that you create between those is very systemic.
No, absolutely. And if there is something that we can all take away with today to avoid this sort of us and them, old against young, what piece of advice would you give us?
Well, I mean, the evidence is that there is none of that sort of gap. So I do feel a bit bad about some of these types of framings, because basically a lot of my points are, how do we avoid the negative effects of stereotypes that split us? When actually the real discussion, and much more in the book, is the massive positive benefits of connecting generations,
Absolutely.
the more positive benefits of connecting generations. And they're like some of the best evidence social science stuff you can get, is that there's benefits to both old and young from being connected around a particular cause. And that's, so it's not just about mitigating the negatives, it is about actually getting new positive outcomes.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, I have to say this perfect segue into doing a little plug for this. I mean, I have to say, I'll tell Bobby this. He's my research crush at the moment. This book is absolutely extraordinary, and I think anyone who's involved in design or creating things, or involved in aging, needs to read this book, because actually, and as Bobby was saying, is that it really shows what we have in common across the ages. And I think with an issue such as climate crisis, we need to work together. We've got a big enough battle as we have without having to fight each other across the ages. So, Bobby, I think the book is wonderful, and thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
So now we're going to move on to our panel discussion, which is a chance to discuss some of these issues in more detail and more casually, and then we'll move on to questions and answers from the audience, if we could. So you've met two of our speakers, and you've met Sophia. We have an extra sort of panelist who you haven't met, Shravan Joshi, MBE. And Shravan is an elected member of the City of London Corporation and chair of the recently established Continuum Advisory Group, a think tank focused on sustainability and how to bring together policymakers, financiers and technology providers. The problems that we are discussing today here are problems, no doubt, he faces every day in his job. So I'm hoping he's got some insight for us. So if we could all sit in the panel, please. And we might have to pass around our microphones. So I'm going to, Shravan, I'm going to come to you first because you didn't get to speak as part of our debate. And I'd just like to ask you about the example that I gave, what the City of London is looking at, what it's thinking the solution might be of green transport and an ageing population in London. Obviously, this is a little bit of self-interest as an ageing individual living in London.
Yeah, no, thanks. And yeah, fascinating stuff, isn't it? I'm going to make sure my kids read that book. So, just a bit about, so to answer the question. So we are the oldest existing democratic body in the world. So we understand ageism.
Right.
When we had the calls for the declarations of climate emergency that went out a couple of years ago, we actually decided not to declare a climate emergency. We took the active step of not making that sort of that noise that went with it. Instead, we spent 6 to 8, I think it's about 8 months actually, collecting data. So we went out and we monitored how people behave, how they move around, how do they actually mobilize around the square mile, where are the air pollution hotspots, how are they created? And we then formulated a climate action plan, which has now been passed in our legislature, and we are executing an ambitious plan to get to net zero by 2027 for our own assets, and I think it's 2040. I think it might be reduced to 2030 actually for the wider city. Fully funded by our own money, not the public purse, and we think that's a more progressive way of actually achieving those climate goals. In terms of green transport, I'm going to pull some stats now because there are misconceptions about how people behave and how they actually travel around London. Most car journeys through the city were transits. They weren't actually coming to or from the square mile. They were travelling through the city. And so we've taken quite active measures. We're lucky enough to be able to control our streets to actually divert or discourage people from using that sort of rat run through the square mile. Over 90% of journeys to or from the city are pedestrian. And we found, when you bring age into it, over 86% of people over the age of 65 actually walk as a journey at least once a week. In terms of disabled people, and I'm including the full spectrum of disabilities here, I think it's 81% of people will walk as a journey once a week. So when you actually question and undertake consultations with people, they don't want to have special treatment, I use that word very carefully, to accommodate them within active transport. They actually want to have an inclusive urban environment that allows them to behave in as normal a way as possible. They want to walk, they want to use the streets and walkways as they are, but want that facility to be more inclusive. I hope that somehow answers that.
If I was to give you a magic wand and a bottomless bucket of money to spend, what would you do on it to improve the square mile for
So I think that's the exact problem. The problem is you're asking me. And I think the problem is we're not asking the people that actually live those journeys. And so I mean we're working with a group called Transport for All, and who take their soundings on how people actually want to be treated and how they want to use the streets. And what we're finding is they want better street access, but they want the streets to be more navigable. They want better wayfinding. We've started putting the old chaps in bowler hats on the streets to help people wayfind. When you're looking at people with mental illnesses, trying to get around and navigate is a real difficulty. And just having a human being there to be able to say, how do I get to X? Or having them approach you and say, can I help you get to X? Overcomes a lot of those obstacles. So it's more about creating an inclusive pedestrian environment for us in the city. It's also we work a lot with TfL on making sure that the public transport links are actually accessible. So step-free access, the ability to bring prams and wheelchairs and all the rest of it easily without that sort of, right, we're going to hold the train for 5 minutes while we let the wheelchair on, all that kind of stuff, which actually discourages people from using public transport.
And Sophia, from your research, has anything come up? Are cities better environments to live than, say, the countryside in a warming climate? Is it? I'm just planning my retirement, so should I be staying in London or should I be heading out to the country? Scotland Highlands seems attractive at the minute.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm trying to think in terms of exactly on that agenda. But we know that just one example of retirement homes are actually really really linked to positive health outcomes, health and well-being outcomes, reduction in loneliness, and actually that's something we don't think about very much. I don't think it's got as much traction, and many people are actually thinking about thinking about moving to those kind of residences as perhaps, given the significantly positive impact on health and well-being outcomes. So I mean they're kind of dispersed everywhere. In terms of downsizing, there's a lot of positives. I think we talked about it before. There's might be less of a need to it's easier to kind of make it more inclusive and adapt, ensure that, if you have health needs down the line, it's a lot easier. But, a lot of people are quite reluctant to downsize. And, of course, we're seeing people remaining with their children at home for longer. So it's not, there shouldn't be any stigma at all. But perhaps the government could provide some incentives and make it easier for people to downsize because we know there's some and positives there. It also frees up housing for the rest of the economy. I'm not sure about. I think it just depends on, like I think you were mentioning, how inclusive that particular area is. There's some areas that are doing really well. We've seen like age-inclusive cities, towns, dementia-friendly high streets. I think that's a particular area that maybe is less considered actually in terms of the mental kind of cognitive decline. Making sure that wayfinding, making sure that places are easily recognisable. There's people there to ask for help. I think that's something that is lagging a bit compared to the mobility side of things. So I think it just depends on the area. So checking for those elements. And thinking about retirement housing. There's actually a lot of interesting research there.
Great. Bob, I'm going to ask you, just because I was very interested in this intergenerational thing. I spent about 5 or 6 years as design director of a dementia care company upmarket. And the move was all about building development in London. This idea of let's create a spaceship and land it somewhere in the countryside and put all our old people there, and that's the answer. Is there any generational thing? Is there, because a lot of people are put into care by their children. I don't mean by, but they make the decision and instigate it. Is there any difference between the idea of what makes a good retirement based on age, or where one should be?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I mean, related to that, what I didn't realise until I started looking at the book is just how unusually age segregated our places have become. So I didn't really, it was, when you look at the old age dependency ratio in the UK, up until the 1991 census, there was basically no difference between cities all the way down to villages. There's some great Centre for Towns work on this. But then it just goes in utterly different directions, with cities getting younger, towns, villages getting older. And it was very stark, and it kind of mirrors a trend that they saw in the US, and as usual, we're just a little bit behind that US trend, where respected academics there talking about it as a dangerous experiment in the most age-segregated society that humans have ever lived in. So I think there has been, we have had these pressures of separation between the age ranges that really, I think, as an expert in the planning of this, it sort of happened by accident because we weren't paying attention, because we didn't really have much of an idea of both the benefits of age integration and the risks of age segregation in this. And because I see in the end of the book that I think the biggest risk of, from a generational perspective, is not all these fake wars, generational wars, or culture wars, all around climate change, but it's separation is our biggest risk, because that leads to stereotyping, disconnects, as well as losing those positive benefits. Now we have an enormous age gradient in our political party support between young and old across in the UK, across Labour and Conservative Party, in particular in England, I guess, more than UK as a whole. All of that sort of thing, plus we're living much more separate digital lives. It is absolutely true, your film about 100% internet access, but still doing different things on different platforms and living more of our lives digitally in a more separated way. So it's really, there's a lot of kind of connecting themes of separation where all of your great work and great thinking around design about how do you actually create more age-integrated communities is, I think, really, really central.
And we all know the dangers of creating ghettos, I think, from history. There was something that you brought up, so I'm going to throw to George, because I know what she's going to say, I think, or maybe I don't know what she's going to say, but we did talk about the whole book, and the whole premise is that it seems to be okay for young people to say old generations do and older generations don't, and even the other way around, for older generations, well, young people do and young people don't. And one of the things we talk about, if you take the word old out and replace that word with any other marginalised or discriminated against group, you just couldn't say it publicly. You wouldn't get away with it. Why is it still okay to say old people and then have anything after that statement? Because I know you've been in this area much longer than I have, 25 years.
Yeah, I mean, it is appalling. And I think it's just interesting how powerful the verbalization of aging is. I mean, it's quite interesting. Just before I forget, I will get back to this column, but just that this word downsizing that you used, Sophia, that is part of the problem. That is part of the problem, downsizing. It feels that I'm giving something up. And I think we've got to really think about the language that we use, and definitely around age. I mean, the fact is that we can say things about older people that, as you said, Colm, which we would never, ever say about anyone else because of their gender, because of their ethnicity, because of their sexuality, but we can say that. But I also think equally, and I think this is very, very true from the work that I've done, but also in your book, Bobby, that we are very ageist across all generations. And I think the more that we have this conversations around connectivity, around thinking about where I am now at this stage of my life, and that I will get older, and that I was once younger, that actually we can then start to have a conversation, especially around something as so critical as climate crisis. We need to sort of find the language which unites us. I really, really do. But yeah, I mean, I could get sort of like quite angry, but I'm trying not to get angry today.
It's okay, you can be angry. We don't mind that.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Yes.
Sorry to break your cycle, Colm. Do you think there's a denial issue here with ageism as well, in that society wants to project as being young and healthy and have vitality, and actually, as people who are older, we're not actually admitting that? Do you think there's a denial issue there?
Well, I mean, I think it's because that if we think that, a couple of years ago it was we are bombarded with between 5,000 and 10,000 images a week, right? Okay. Now, if we think about that to do with the imagery that we see around aging, it is 99.1% negative. It's getting a bit better, but it's still predominantly negative. So if that is all you see, of course you're going to start worrying about it. It becomes to that self-fulfilling prophecy. So actually, I think one of the things that we're trying to do at the Design Age Institute, definitely with this age thing, is how can we show the reality of more positive images of aging, so we start to think about it in a different kind of way. But the visualization, the verbalization of age is so dramatically negative. So of course, why wouldn't you want to? And there was an amazing bit of research done by Rebecca Levy, a Harvard psychologist, a huge survey, and she found that people who are more worried about getting older live on average 7.5 years less. Nothing to do with exercise, nothing to do with diet, just their mindset. Now the thing is, the mindset comes from what we see and what we hear, and that is negative. So I don't know if that helps.
No, absolutely. It's one of the things we see a lot, and we talk a lot about it, is that the brand of being old is really negative. There's almost nothing positive put in the media about being old. It upset us. We did post a little thing on LinkedIn about it when the Queen turned down her Oldie Award because she said she wasn't old at 95 or 7 or whatever age she's reached. And you wonder why she said that, as if being old was a negative in itself. So it is something to talk about. You wonder how you deal with that negativity, that aging is just a negative, full stop. And we're all guilty of it. Even us, when we first joined the Design Age Institute, we founded, I created an image of myself 20 years into the future. And everybody started copying it. And the initial reaction was, oh God, look at me. Why? He says, well, you look older, nothing else. Not uglier, not less able, not less vibrant, and we had to actually pick ourselves up on it ourselves, that it's so ingrained in us to think that aging is negative that we have to do something about it. I don't know, did I interrupt you, Bobby?
No, I think you covered it. It was really, it was just in this piece for George, there's a great thing from, is it Marketing Week from 35 years ago, where it sort of it says, finally ad agencies have woken up to the fact that older people are buying more than pantyhose or something. It was a US article, so finally smart people in Adland have woken up to this, but it was from 35 years ago. And you do look at now, and you keep thinking that we're going to learn this lesson, and we never quite get to fulfilling that lesson, I think. And it does point to your point about there's something deeply ingrained. I think there's a personal aspect to it, as well as a reinforcement aspect in the communications.
Well, I've got a follow-up, slightly different question for you. One of the concerns I have is these are two huge agendas, an ageing population and climate change. Does bringing them together give them double the weight and double the opportunity to talk, or does it just overwhelm because suddenly it's suddenly got twice as difficult?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's sort of I think it's unavoidable in some ways to bring. So I think you're better doing it in a planned way than an unplanned way, if you see what I mean, because they are going to rub up against each other. And I thought presentation was brilliant in terms of all the interlinkages, and I'd learned lots from that. But you can just see why. How on earth do you disentangle that, and what would be the negative impacts of disentangling that? I see the point from, because everyone, obviously it's COP week, so everyone is attaching their own cause to climate in some sort of way, and there is always going to be that issue of actually everyone wants to connect to those things, and your point was very well made about where the money is going, and you have to be integrating that. So I had, like I say, a panel discussion earlier on today on similar sorts of themes, but slightly different elements of health that people would think about, more about health inequalities across age ranges, not just old versus young. And it was the same from their perspective. It's going to be such a big challenge, ongoing for years and decades, that not thinking of your policy area in light of its connection to climate is going to be more or less impossible. It's going to be increasingly difficult to keep separate. So doing it in a planned way, I think, is... But you're right that it is a challenge of not just making it seem too big or too complicated to interconnect them, but also you're going to be in the space where every other area, every other single aspect of life is going to say, but we're also connected to climate change, and that's quite hard to get your own space.
Is this anything that's come across in your research about lots of agendas coming together and suddenly it just gets too big to deal with?
Yeah, I'm not sure yet exactly if I've seen it, but I think it's a really, really good point. And I think looking at the linkages, it does seem that there are specific ways where, we really should be focusing on, specific agenda synergies and maybe not focusing on everything. Because like you said, I think we'll kind of get lost in the details. So, like, to give an example, there was a World Health Organization report on sustainable health systems, and I think it was really great. Talked about the synergies, but it was really focused on why, health systems should be sustainable. It wasn't kind of broadening out between, maybe topics that are relevant. I think it was really focused and really powerful. There's other reports like the World Health Organization Healthy Aging report. It's just another one top of mind, really. And that one really failed to I think there's some really significant linkages, and there are loads of other reports saying, really missed a kind of opportunity here. There's a decade of healthy aging going on at the moment. Are we really linking? I think there's some really key elements. So I think it's, maybe about focusing on those specific points, really focusing on those. And I think just from an aging, because obviously we work on kind of thinking about how to adapt to an aging population, thinking ahead, really. We are planning for the future. Obviously, there's so much going on already, but we're kind of thinking about policies kind of going forward, really. So it just makes sense to kind of plan ahead. I think, as Bobby was saying, now in all of these agendas where relevant, it just doesn't make sense to, for all of the reasons I said. And, an additional point is actually, in many cases, a lot of new ideas actually emerge from creating these links. So there's one example of an age-friendly city and age-friendly community and sustainable city communities where they had a lot of different ideas when they actually merged in one area. And just one point, linking back before, I think intergenerational kind of ways of, so the more younger people getting involved in kind of sustainable city agendas actually, or quite a lot of younger people in those agendas, and then not kind of to stereotype here, but there was, and then older adults in the other one, and there was more kind of intergenerational ways of working together. That was really positive. There's loads of synergies that they hadn't quite thought about, that actually they realised, they could get more traction for focusing on air pollution, or focusing on the health and the sustainable benefits. So it's just, I think it's really positive, just focusing on the right elements, and there's loads out there.
Shravan, I gave you your magic wand. You didn't use it very well, I don't think. So I'm going to give George a magic wand with a design hat on. How would you tackle this problem? Because obviously we're part of the Helen Hanlon Centre for Design. We've been doing inclusive design for 30 years, and involving and including everybody in the design process is really important. But again, maybe if we think about London, if you had a magic wand and you were tackling the dual agendas or 4 agendas or 1 agenda, what would you want to solve first?
Can I go to Norway?
You can go to Norway if you wish.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you. And it's exactly what you were talking about, is that there's an amazing project, the Bergen Light Railway. So this was a project which was the light railway was used, but they knew they needed to think about how to revamp it. But what they did was they involved the whole city. They spoke to older adults, they spoke to people with disabilities, they spoke to parents with kids, and they co-designed the Bergen Light Railway with people. And what happened was so extraordinary. When they launched it, within the year, they had delivered by 150% in terms of the amount of people who were using it. And people who had never used that light railway before were doing it because it was great to design, and they had listened to real people. And I think this is something which is so fundamental in design. And it is, once you get it, you go, how can people not design without talking and listening with an open heart to people? But it happens by big organisations, by government, by industry all the time. So I think for me, it really is. And again, this is what we're trying to do with this age thing, is everyone's got to join, by the way. It's all about our collective future, but it's how can we listen to lived experience? And so I think it's wonderful what you did with the, in lockdown, just doing that research, talking, listening to people. And I love what you said about the man with the bowler hat, is that we focus too much on technology and stuff like that. Human connection, wonderful. Honestly, brilliant.
And there is a big difference between being online and being a frequent user and confident user of things online. So yeah, it's just saying that, oh, you're online, solve it with your app that you must download onto your phone. I think you failed to mention your Magic Wand project, which was the parking app. I thought that was your pet project.
Oh,
Won't go to that.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, don't get me on parking apps. Yeah.
We
How
used,
badly designed are they? Hands up. Yes, exactly. Thank you.
in the design industry and the public sector, we talk a lot at the minute about wicked problems. And before the wicked problem, there was the foggy project. And in the middle somewhere, there was systemic design. When I was at the NHS, everything was a systemic problem and had to have a systemic solution. But it's all saying the same thing. It's just difficult, you know, and you've got to involve everybody. Is there, again, maybe Bobby come to you about involving not just all generations, but all aspects in solving this problem. Is it easy? Is it difficult? Is it something you're seeing any evidence of?
It's definitely difficult. I think you've yes, we've had all sorts of programs. So I'm director of a policy institute in my kind of day job. So we have all sorts of programs and things that we look at about the too difficult box and why do they end up in the too difficult box, and what is the approach to this? I mean, I do think, and part of our sort of work is about being very multi-method and interdisciplinary in terms of how you approach these types of things. So the things that we're doing most of now is much more deliberative methods, much more deliberative approaches where you are bringing people in to the conversation not just in the way of consulting them, but with some clear power relationship where you have got a commitment to do something as a result of that interaction. So these are like the citizen assembly models that you will have seen on a lot on climate, but on lots of other issues too. So I think bringing people into that is increasingly important, coming up with not just the best solutions, but ones that have got a legitimacy with people for their interpretation. One thing I would just add, just more from an intergenerational point of view, because I think even in this discussion we are quite bounded by, we're talking about old versus young today in some ways, or old with young today, but these are intergenerational problems or challenges, and they will need intergenerational solutions. So, I mean, I think our real problem with the kind of too difficult box or wicked problems type stuff is that our chronic short-termism in terms of our response to it, because there's actually the political cycles, media cycles, everything else is just geared to quick answers to these things that don't have quick answers, and they are long-term investments. And that was a lot of the discussion on the other panel today, because it is when you look at the investment in, say, some public health behaviours like smoking cessation, that was about trying to get people to quit smoking there, but it was much more about just taking that out of the environment for younger generations so that they don't get that norm embedded in them and it's really worked with Gen Z. We have finally broken that sort of link. So it's that long-term aspect. So final thing I'd say though is just on that future generations, what you find is there's lots of great initiatives that take that deliberative method but also get a part of the group to play the part of the future generation, so someone who's going to be born or living in 2050, and you put them into that sort of role. You have to play the role of citizens in 2050 rather than, and it's incredible. Tokyo does this a lot, and it's incredibly effective at getting people to lift their heads to longer term. Very simple, very straightforward deliberative method, but incredibly effective at getting people to lift their heads to longer term solutions. So I think that would be my main thing, is how do we get Roman Krznaric, who's a great Australian stroke UK philosopher who wrote The Good Ancestor. He talks a lot about long and short thinking and why we get pulled towards short thinking, but we should be trying to do long thinking, and how we treat the future as a colony we can just pillage for things for today. And there's lots of this stuff in, slight movements towards actually longer term thinking with a future generations commissioner in Wales, and lots of other little initiatives that are starting to come. And I think that's the crux of lots of this, is can we just get longer term thinking institutionally embedded into our politics and economics.
So I'm going to challenge you therefore and say I think if you want longer term thinking, you must take it out of the hands of the politicians who are on a 4-year cycle or 5-year cycle. So is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree. I mean, look, the Future Generation Commissioner is based on an act, a legislative act that has been put through by the Welsh Government. So obviously, future governments can repeal that type of legislation. But once you get the kind of momentum of those types of things, I don't know whether people have read Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, but that says Kim Stanley Robinson, more of a science fiction writer, but very interested in climate, and they came up with this. He came up with this conceit of the UN has set up a ministry for the future because all the national governments are failing, so they have to treat the rights of future generations as just as valid as the rights of current generations. And what would that do to change your thinking if you genuinely thought you've got as much responsibility to future generations as current generations? And it's amazing the sort of interweb that Kim Stanley Robinson comes up of, how you need to embed it in the economics, coming up with new carbon currencies. You have to do all sorts of things with changing the incentives so that it really, as you were describing, about making bad behaviour so difficult or impossible for people, including black ops and stuff they had as part of the novel. But there was lots of this sort of big mess. But the main thing was future generations being as important as current generations within a act that all these people were signed up to. And the Pope talked about it the other in his last Episcopal letter or something. I think the Pope is starting to think about the rights of future generations are being part of our responsibility today. So there's lots of these things going on, but they need to be institutionalised. Is the option.
And so, on the point of kind of wicked problems or systemic problems, Shravan, I'm just going to ask you again. I mean, the audience, no doubt, there'll be a lot of designers in the audience tonight, both digitally and in the room. And I've always thought that a really good design solution first needs a really good problem. If you had a chance to pitch a problem to the designers listening, what would you say that City of London needs people to look at as soon as possible, particularly the talent that exists at the Royal College of Art?
Sure. I think the big problem that we face certainly is we have a limited geographical footprint. We're a small country and we're a smaller city, and so we go high. That's what we've been doing. We've been redeveloping to go as high as we can, and we need growth. You can't not have growth in an economy. You've got to have growth. But it's how do you do that sustainably? How do you do that responsibly? And there's a huge debate about refurbishment against redevelopment on land. And I think one of the biggest challenges we've got is really understanding, and not just sort of putting numbers out there, but actually understanding carbon footprints and actually understanding embedded carbon footprints and operational carbon footprints and actually carbon recovery over time and how that really works. There's huge advances in material sciences. There's huge advances in industrial metal production to go green or blue or whichever colour you choose. It's building that entire supply chain and financing it and being able to deliver it. And I think the design element of it actually is throughout that stream. I don't think it's just at the point of delivery of a building. I think it's all the way through that sort of upstream production side as well.
I think this is also a design challenge. We look at it a lot and we talk about it a lot, but this idea of carbon footprints, carbon recovery, carbon offset, who actually knows what all that means in terms of the whole population? I don't know, George, have you come across this? Have you any? I'm going to pick on George because you're furthest away from me.
Well, I'm so glad you asked me that question because I learned something yesterday which I was shocked by. Our carbon footprint, that concept was developed by BP.
That's right.
Right, so it's flawed even in its thinking. It was designed by BP to make us feel better about flying and using our cars, so we could do other things to do that. So it goes back to. I love this idea that you talked about, Bobby. Is that an intergenerational way of connecting all of us about the future generations. How can we become a good ancestor? So this is all about designing for our future self. How about designing for future generations in 100, 200 years' time? And I think that then we can start becoming more empathetic. We can sort of like connect, as you said, to what it could be like, what it is really like. And I think until we do that, I think we can talk about data, we can talk about stats, we can talk about whatever. But design, as we know, design can either make things enable us or disable us, and a lot of it is disabling us at the moment, but it needs to be designed with a big heart and a real sense of responsibility for future generations, I think. But that's shocking about carbon footprint, isn't it?
Did not know that.
I know.
I'm going to ask one more question of the panel before we open it up to the audience and to the people online. And if I'm poking around with my phone, I'm actually checking questions that are coming in. I'm not texting my daughter. And the last question is, I was speaking to somebody in a meeting this morning. They run a children's hospital, and they were talking about infection control and how to create the perfect infection control room in a children's hospital. And it reminded me again from my time at the NHS, where I did a lot of work in infection control. It's just a completely forgotten agenda. We did infection control. We did it 12 years ago. We've solved healthcare-associated infections. And of course we haven't. It's just been overtaken by Brexit, it's been overtaken by elections, it's been overtaken by the pandemic. And what we've just learnt from this pandemic is all those things we learnt about infection control 15, 20 years ago should have been widespread now in the public, and they weren't. It was an initiative and it disappeared. Which one of these initiatives is going to disappear first? Climate change or an ageing population, or which one is going to win the battle for our attention most, climate change or an ageing population? Because it seems like we've only got the attention span for one great emergency at any one time. Sophia, I'm going to pick on you because...
That's a mean...
It's interesting. Definitely at the moment, I think, I mentioned a few times, but I really do think, maybe that's, there's a reason for this, but climate change is getting more global traction. So immediate, we're seeing people dying every day, but obviously an ageing population will become more and more prevalent to policymakers going forward. So we know, basically people aging across the world in developed economies. Most countries will see people, populations over a quarter of their population will be age 60 and over, but in developing economies, they're aging quickest going forward. So I think it's going to become more important going forward. But I kind of going back to your earlier question, I do think there's a real incentive for ageing agendas to link, because I think they do get less funding, they do get less traction. There's just so many synergies, but I think particularly for them. So I think at least in the short term, that will be the case. Maybe, if we've solved climate change, then ageing might still be. But I think in the short term, I think there's a real incentive, just in that direction in terms of the funding and attention perspective.
Thank you. Bobby, any last thoughts on that?
No, I thought that was a great answer, I think.
Superb. Great. So, George, over to you.
Okay.
Last thoughts?
Yeah, well, you know what I'm going to say? Impossible is nothing. And I have to say, Sophia, after putting those two together, it's like once you have that thought, you can't go back. I have awareness now, right? So you can't think of aging without thinking about the climate crisis and sustainability. And we need systemic change. It goes back to what you were talking, what you were learning about, Colin, only a few years back. But we need to join together on all these issues. So they are all interlinked. And I think that actually, if we all step back and sort of see the nugget of what the issue is, I think there was a great quote. Oh God, I haven't got it on me. That was by this lawyer who was speaking at COP26, and he said, it's not about science. The science has been out there. The science has been out there for 30 years. Actually, the biggest issues are apathy, ignorance, and greed. And I think that those are the things that we sort of like need to get behind. And how we do that is we connect ourselves around thinking about the future generations. But if I had to choose one at this particular moment, I'm not quite sure. Yeah. Climate crisis.
Shravan, you're going to get the same question, I'm afraid.
Well, do you know, I think these are new problems, aren't they? I mean, a few hundred years ago, people didn't live beyond the age of 40. So ageism wasn't an issue, you know. It wasn't part of the equation. And likewise, you know, what was climate change about? You know, it didn't exist. We're too busy pumping out carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So I think there are new problems, and as Sophia's highlighted really eloquently, that they're hugely interlinked. But I think if we're going to tackle one, actually, I think they both fall under the banner of sustainability. Is we've got to have a sustainable future, and if you use that as an umbrella, you can probably tackle both, because there are common solutions for both, aren't there? They're not delinked. So I think it's about finding a higher sort of platform to actually address.
Great. Thank you.
Brilliant answer.
We'll now open it up to the audience for any questions for the panel or comments on what you've seen and heard this evening. Rama, don't even have to ask your name.
Thank you so much. So this is a question mostly for George, but probably for the rest of the panel. Please put my glasses on. You mentioned the lawyer at COP26, and you actually sent me his quote.
I did.
So I wanted to read it out and ask you a question. It's a very small one.
Yeah.
But it's James Gustav Speth, who said, I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought with 30 years of good science we could address these problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. So how do we kickstart that? Just a small question.
You can answer it.
I think that's quite easy. Well, I mean, I think, you know, Rama, the work that you're doing about creative leadership and how that feeds into design. So, Colin, you said it that beautifully, that the first session that we did here, half the world's been designed beautifully by Mother Nature. The rest has been designed by people, not man. I'm getting better at that. And a lot of it has been designed badly. So I think a big part of it is educating designers to design from a very empathetic, heartfelt perspective. And that goes back to what Bobby was saying. We need to step into the shoes of people who are incredibly marginalized or on the edge, because actually if you design for the margins, you make our life better for everyone. So I think this is what we do. How we do that, actually, it is through dialogue. It is through education, listening, and learning, and it is about human connection. And I just still can't get over how fantastic the man in the bowler hat, in you know, as a real sort of understanding of the complexity of wayfinding, is that actually it is about human connection. So. To me, that is quite easy, but I think it's about we need to open our hearts more, but educate designers to design from a truly heartfelt, humanistic perspective. Yeah.
Superb. Any other questions? Yes, at the back there, and then one at the front and on the left.
Hi, it's an excellent question. I'm a graphic design lecturer now, after 25 years of industry in television. I'm now teaching 16 to 18-year-olds graphic design at a further education college. Today we spent the whole day discussing this by accident, because it's part of the criteria for UAL Level 3 extended diploma, and they themselves are actually, we'll come back to what you were saying, George, they themselves are activating it. I'm not introducing, they're discussing it. And interestingly, coming back to what we said a bit earlier about younger generations comparing to each other, my 17-year-old group, my second years, discussed today about how people who are 2 years younger than them, coming up through school, have got a bad idea about the future. It just came up in conversation. So from the 16-year-olds that I've been around for the last 16 years, I want to say they are thinking, they particular about what they are doing, not what I, as a 61-year-old, have done. So I just want to say that to the group, really, because what I've listened to tonight actually covers what happened naturally in my studio today.
Superb. Wonderful to hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, by the way.
That's all right.
This is going to be ongoing discussion with my students.
And there's a question here as well. So there's somebody's have to jog round, I'm afraid. And maybe if you give us your name when you ask the question, so we know.
My name is Maria Angela. My question a bit, we're talking about sustainability as a big umbrella, and for me, something that is key about sustainable design is not only about how green is it, but how useful or the longevity of the project is going to be for the future. So taking that into consideration, shouldn't we also take in consideration, for example, the changing concept of old generation? Because at least in my perspective, what I've seen is that, we are young for longer, and previous generations were, aging, let's say, faster. So I think this is like a question for maybe all of you. But you have the issue about people being afraid of aging, but that would also kind of enter into the fact that it has helped extend the life expectancy and all the health advancements, and the fact that that concept of old generation has changed. So what sort of ideas would you have in mind, taking into consideration that sustainability is, the longevity of the project? What ideas do you have to take in consideration that changing concept of old generations? Because maybe the idea that you have for old generations today is going to change in 50 years, the same way it changed from 100 years ago to today.
Bobby, I'm afraid I'm going to have to throw this one at you. This seems to be right up your street, I'd have thought.
Yeah. I was just wondering whether the older generation's aging more quickly was aimed at us. You said it was for the panel, so I sort of. I'm sure you were looking at me. Absolutely. So one of the real trends, a lot of the book my book is about separating myths and realities. So there's lots of nonsense about generational differences. One of the real trends is a delayed adulthood. So people are going through life stages later in current generations, and there's no reason to say that that's going to stop it. That could continue. There are some things that can't go too late in life biologically, but a lot of that is flexible and has changed a lot over recent years. So that is a real thing. And then at the other end of the spectrum, the 100-year life and all Andrew's work and all that type of stuff about how people are viewing this life course very differently, that is also true, and projecting that forward is going to be true. But that's, again, I sort of come back to the point that is natural and inevitable about society, that we have these types of changes over time, or we end up being stagnant pond when if nothing changes on those types of things. So I think it is going to happen. It should be built into our thinking that it's really difficult for us not to think that the current situation in society is the natural one, and it's going to stay like that, rather than thinking that it's going to keep evolving and changing. So, I mean, what I find very useful in understanding future change is to look at how different we become from the past, which is more or less what you're saying. So taking a generational view of looking a long way back shows you just how quickly we have changed, and then that helps you project to the future. So, I mean, it's not an answer to your question, but it's like a way of thinking that places us not at the end point of like this is the culmination of development. It's just part of a flow that will keep going. There is one final thing. There is a really lovely concept called the 200-year life, which is it thinks that you think of yourself as in the middle of looking couple of generations back and a couple of generations forward, the people that you will actually meet, probably your grandparents through to your grandchildren, is a kind of 200-year span. And it's a lovely kind of way of thinking about how you have been created by the history that got us to here, but then how your actions now will affect the next 2 generations. And there's kind of, I find that really useful. There's a lot of talk about seven generation thinking, which I think is quite hard to get your head around. But I get that 200-year life is a really good way, and it helps, I think, your type of question of thinking we're not at the end of a process.
And I think I'd probably add to that this idea of age is difficult because life is a journey. Getting old is a journey. You know, no matter how hard I might try, I do not know what it is like growing up as a woman on this planet, in this country at this time. It's very hard for a middle-aged man to have empathy with that situation. Where I was young, and I am older, and I will be older still, and you will be older. This is a journey you will be on. If we're lucky, we will all grow to be old. So this isn't the other. This is us. And I think so. This idea that, you know, what do I feel? Do I feel different from what you should feel? Well, we shouldn't, because I plan to live forever. So, you know, I'm definitely thinking about in 200 years. I love the idea that we just weren't optimistic enough for the 100-year life. The 200-year life is definitely the way to go. You know, so it's, you know, this is designed for your future self. It isn't just about aging. It's about the environment. I want a planet here in 50 years' time, you know, that I can enjoy living in. Anybody else want to?
Yeah, the one thing that struck me when you asked your question was that there's a saying, isn't there, that civilization's judged by how it treats its most vulnerable.
Mm.
And one of the things that's come out of, you know, the presentation we had and what you presented as well, Bobby, is that actually there's a lack of compassion in society, isn't there? There's just a lack of sort of civility and compassion to understand and want to understand how other people behave and what their needs are. And I think, you know, if we start to have a little bit of compassion and start to meet the needs of different people, different from ourselves, that's when we start to perhaps build a better judgment for ourselves for future generations. To look back, as you said, are we good ancestors? It's a really good way to look at how we move forward. You know, when we make decisions that are grandiose, well, are we going to be good ancestors for making those decisions? Yeah.
One final question, if we have one. If not, then it is, yes. Thank you.
We spoke about climate change and aging and how they are different from one another, and I do feel like they are different from one another, but they do have similarities in a big way. With climate change, for instance, it applies more in the future than aging. But my question is, right, so as we go older, there's going to be a new generation. Like, it's going to be a new generation which I've never heard of before. I don't know what the next generation will be. And the older we get, there's going to be a new thing that the older generation doesn't know about. At the moment, there's the major thing between the older generation, I keep saying old, maybe not.
Older is good. Old is not so good.
It's mainly technology.
Yeah.
So the hardest part is adapting quite one another. So it's going to be new technology, and in London especially, it's becoming more diverse.
Mm.
It's going to be more cultures, it's going to be more people, more colours, more. So what's your thoughts in adaptation?
Yeah, this is again something we talk about at the Institute quite a bit, that maybe 100 years ago and beyond, if you were born then, you could reasonably expect the world to be vaguely similar when you died from when you were born, and that a lifetime of accrued wisdom was somehow useful to you and your children and your grandchildren. But the speed of acceleration of change means that all the wisdom that I've accrued can't teach my daughter about social media, because I have no idea about how you manage that. And I think we're going to see that technology and other aspects of life are going to change more and more rapidly. So a lot of the wisdom that people might accrue and the intelligence and the knowledge and the memories might not be that useful. And it is, I think, that is going to accelerate. When I started practicing 30 years ago, there was no internet, there was no, the fax machine came, and it was like a wild invention that you could send a drawing from London to Paris and get a reply within 20 minutes, as opposed to sending it by courier and waiting a week and a half. And so from that to the point now where we've got a computer on our telephone, is the speed of change, and that is just going to get worse, I think, and it is going to be a problem.
No, I agree. And even with us, I used to, I'm not living now, and I used to have all this happening to show kids at home like that, so I used to send across pictures that we took nowadays, they can send that through WhatsApp. So yeah, that was the hardest part, and with that, we'd always, so everyone would always say to us, that was your age.
Yeah.
I'm getting it right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's going to happen.
It is. There's some things that are inevitable. I think we've talked about that there is always some conflict between the generations, always has been, but it's no worse now than it ever has been. Or there's not much evidence for that anyway.
No, there isn't, and it's natural and healthy, and in fact, it's society growing to a halt with that. It's literally, it's the biggest thinkers in philosophy and sociology would say it's the basic determinant of the speed of human development is that generational change, and just as Colin said, that technological change is a key aspect to it, but it's not so much what platform you're on or what bits of widgets you use. It is about economic control. Who has the skills and experience in order to produce, and that is where this integration of new types of media that we don't understand, but that being commoditized and monetized and being put into the into the economy. That's the crucial trend that kind of Mannheim was talking about at the Industrial Revolution. Is the speed of change in technology matters because of the economics of it, not the social aspects of it, which is really important to bear in mind.
Great. We're a little bit over time, so I am going to bring us to an end. We would like, that was the slide of the Q&A. Would just like to bring your attention to a few things that are coming up, if you're interested. So another talks that we're giving. We have a talk with Patricia Moore, the queen of inclusive design from the States. If you haven't heard of her, check her out. We have a Wisdom Hour workshop coming up here in a few weeks, which is a way of exploring age-based wisdom and does it exist? Is it worth anything? And then another Designing for Future Selves here, which is all about, called Adults Only because it's all about sex and intimacy, which is rather going to be more difficult for me, I think.
Where do you sign up for that one?
You sign up today. We'll not let you out until you have. But you can find about this and much more at designage.org or on thisagething.co, where we tend to publish these things. I wouldn't be out here live if I didn't plug Rama's book as well. Rama behind you is director of the Helen Hanlon Centre for Design and has just launched a book looking at creative leadership. Again, I would recommend anybody who's interested to purchase it. I don't know whether you're giving discounts, Rama? Yes, you are. Good man. And then lastly, if you get time, if you would, please fill in the feedback to let us know how we've done and whether you'd be coming back. So just to, final word for me, just closing remarks. I thought it was a stimulating conversation. I learned more than I thought I was going to do because I'd read all the slides and spoken to all the speakers, but learned so much from just listening to the discussion. And the one thing that leaves me is this idea of the good ancestor. I think we've just mentioned it. Wonderful idea that we're caretakers here. We're not. This isn't our planet. And that when we talk about design for our future self, which is a phrase we coined a long time ago at the Helen Hanlon Centre, that we thought it meant designing for an aging population for ourselves as we grow older. But actually, of course, that's the planet as well. Our future selves will be living on this planet, and we need to look after it. And I think that message came across powerfully in most of what we talked about, which was nice to hear. And then the final thing for any innovators, entrepreneurs out there, we are launching one of the things we do at the Design Age Institute is what's called a Pathfinder project, where we help entrepreneurs and innovators get products and services to market through a package of design support and some budget. So if anybody out there is thinking and has prototypes or things in this area and wondering, how do I get this to market, give us a shout. We've got a new call for applications coming out in January next year, we think. Other than that, it's just for me to say thank you very much for turning up in person. Very brave, and thank you. And a final thank you to our panellists and speakers for coming and talking tonight. Thank you very much.